Good morning to all. First, I'd like to thank Ibraki, Renata Zuccolo, and Beatriz Bellicani for the kind invitation to moderate this panel that will discuss this hot topic on the antitrust agenda, which is sustainability and competition, convergence, and tensions. Sustainability is not a new topic, and in tune right now with COP26, where the discussions that take place could have lasting effects on the global economy. Sustainability entered in the antitrust agenda in around 2012 in the Netherlands upon the publication of the paper Vision Document on Competition and Sustainability. In 2020, the local competition authority published a document called Sustainable Agreements with guidelines for collaboration between companies to reach the climate target established. Similarly, in 2019, the European Union launched the Green Deal, which was then brought into the antitrust agenda too. Recently, a public consultation was made by the DG Competition about the same agenda, and a lot of topics arose on discussion, like quantification of efficiency, definition of relevant market, abuse, state aid, innovation, and also along the same path, we observed the onset of discussions on legal security and lack of regulations. All these discussions we can read when we consult the answers that the companies presented to the DG Competition, and companies like Unilever, companies like InBev and Telefonica. This is the tension, sort of speak, which we are going to discuss today. On the other hand, we are going through a moment of change and improvement, which Professor Ana Frazão wrote in Jota about competition law in the 21st century, or what Commissioner Vestager called the enforcement of the antitrust in a new world. These new discussions are being reflected at ICN, which had sustainability as the topic of its special report on the last meeting in Budapest, and will probably be discussed by competition authorities worldwide. Other organizations like the American Bar Association and OCDE also published papers about sustainability and antitrust. To debate this topic, we have invited three guests that have long been involved in these issues, and also a view from Brazilian competition authority. Let me start to introduce them. First, we will hear from Simon Holmes. Simon has been having advised business for some 35 years as a competition lawyer. Simon is now a judge at the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal and a visiting professor at Oxford University. Most of his work nowadays is on climate change, sustainability, and competition law. Then we are going to hear Diogo Thomson Andrade. He represents the General Superintendence of the Brazilian Competition Authority. After that, we are going to hear Maarten Pieter Schinkel, Professor of Competition Economics and Regulation at the University of Amsterdam, Department of Economics and Business. And finally, we are going to hear Ninette. She's a partner and co-head of the antitrust practice of Freshfields in China. Ninette has more than 20 years of private practice experience advising clients on merger control, foreign investment review, and antitrust investigations. Ninette's practice covers antitrust-related work in China, including Hong Kong and the rest of the Asia Pacific area. So, Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Maria. As Maria said, I've spent most of my career advising business on competition law. And towards the end of that period, I became increasingly aware of a tension between my work as a competition lawyer and climate change, because competition, great as it is driving consumption, driving us to consume ever more products. And also, whilst it will drive things like innovation, it also pushes companies when competing to cut costs. And sometimes it's a race to the bottom with ever more unsustainable practices being practiced. So I spent the last year or two thinking about how sustainability and climate change can be taken into account properly in competition law. I think some of the publications I have in this area have been, a list of those has been circulated or will be circulated. When I started working on this 2 or 3 years ago, there was very little on it, and it was a low-profile subject. Now, and as Maria has indicated, it's one of the hottest areas in antitrust, the other being probably the big tech agenda. And I think there's a real chance that now, even if competition law can't help fight the climate change as such, it can at least be applied in a way that doesn't stand in the way of efforts people are making. I'll come back to where we got to a bit later. But for those less familiar with the topic, I just want to emphasize that sustainability can be relevant to all areas of competition law. And I identify 5. Why 5? Well, that's first because I include public procurement. There are public rules on how the public sector can procure products in many current countries, the EU and internationally. If you just think of the vast spending power of the public purse, what the public spends, the states spend buying things, if that was more sympathetic to green procurement, it could have a transformational effect on the world's economy and the fight against climate change. And then there's state aid. Masses of public money needs to go to support our transition to a greener economy. Much of that is controlled by state aid rules or anti-subsidy rules, and those are being adjusted to accommodate climate change considerations, in particular to help us phase out fossil fuels in a sustainable, in a fair way, and to promote green technologies. And then there's mergers. Now, it's only sometimes going to be relevant, but sustainability can be a positive factor contributing to a deal being cleared, or a negative factor which may contribute towards it being blocked or requiring remedies. And then there's control of monopoly power, abuse of dominance, as we call it in Europe. The relevant provision, Article 102 of our treaty, could be used to fight unsustainable fair trade practices. Exceptionally, I'm not saying this is an everyday thing, but for example, to perhaps combat unsustainable and disgustingly low prices paid for developing world commodities. Or perhaps sustainability could be a shield where companies trying to improve the sustainability of their business are accused of abusing a dominant position, perhaps because they refuse to supply a product to people who are going to misuse it and not recycle it or whatever. On top of my list is cooperation, the rules which the rules which govern agreements and outlaw those which are restrictive of competition. Now, all 5 of those areas are covered in the book, which I co-edited with the Competition Council for Unilever and the head of the Dutch Competition Authority. Only 3 of those are covered in my own writings. That's Article 101, abuse of dominance and mergers. Today, I want to focus particularly on Article 101 and the fear that some people have of competition law when trying to fight climate change. We have an existential crisis in the middle of COP26. I don't need to emphasize that. We need to use all our legal and policy tools. And I often think we should stop arguing as a competition community over exactly which tools we should use. We need to use them all, and we need to use them now. Regulation is often the best solution. I'm sure Maarten Pieter will speak to that. Yes, indeed, it is often the best solution. But all too often, it's too slow in coming, it's too limited to particular countries, and frankly, it's just not ambitious enough in many instances. And business is often prepared to go further than the regulation. Sometimes individual businesses can do that on their own and compete on the sustainability of their products. That's great. Where they can, they should, and indeed, often by law, they must. But in many instances, that's not going to be enough. Sometimes the cost of producing a more sustainable product, at least in the short term, is higher. And it may not be possible to recoup that from companies, what we call first from customers, so they suffer what we call a first mover disadvantage. So they need to work with competitors to make that viable. But even if they could, on their own, sell a few products, if it's just a niche product representing a tiny bit of the market, that's not sufficient given the scale of the crisis. Sometimes we need to do more. Companies working together can transform a whole industry at speed and at scale. But that's, of course, where competition law comes in, because companies have quite rightly been told to be cautious of talking or cooperating with their competitors. So it's this fear of competition law that is the problem. I met many examples, practical examples in my own career. For example, in the UK, efforts to increase the rate of recycling and reduce the use of single packaging involved working with a number of retailers and suppliers, and they were held back. We made great progress, but they're held back by concerns over competition law. And I know a lot of people here are from Brazil. One of the things I was asked about recently was suppliers of soft commodities were willing to work together to reduce deforestation in the Mercosur and Brazilian forest, as in the Cerrado and the Brazilian forest. But they often were uneasy in working with their competitors because of fear of competition law. Now, I would emphasize, I'm in no way favor of what's sometimes called greenwashing or mistermed greenwashing. If people decline to compete on environmental grounds, that's a straightforward cartel. It's not what we're talking about today. The example of that is the EU AdBlue case, where companies are accused of agreeing not to compete on certain environmental criteria. That should be condemned completely. Greenwashing exists, but most of the greenwashing people talk about is a consumer law issue. People make false sustainability claims, not competition law issues. In my work, I've emphasized that we already have the relevant legal tools to accommodate climate change and sustainability. I've written particularly about the EU's constitutional provisions, which require us to embed sustainability into all EU policy, including competition policy. But if you don't have those constitutional provisions, you're not in the EU, as indeed the UK isn't now, sadly, then the competition provisions themselves can accommodate sustainability. And I've written extensively about the law and how that can be done, and I don't plan to go into the detail today. But I would emphasize that my work focuses very much on current law, what the law actually says. And I tried to get people to go back to what the law says and allows or requires, rather than focus on these rather abstract concepts that have crept into competition analysis, like public interest, non-economic factors, consumer welfare, none of which are in the law. They may or may not be useful tools sometimes, but it cannot be the starting point for the analysis. That has to be what the law actually says. So where have we got to? Now, Maria has given us a flavour of that. Industry is getting more involved. She mentioned Unilever. There are many other countries. The International Chamber of Commerce has written a paper on this, and I chaired the working group. International bodies. Maria mentioned the ICN. The ECN is also involved. The OECD held a round table on sustainability and competition policy. And incidentally, if there's a summary of my own views of how on this question of the fear of competition law in a paper I did for the OECD. The member states of the EU are increasingly involved. The Dutch are the market leaders. Maria has already mentioned them, and I'll come back to that. The Greeks have done a lot. The UK, France, Belgium have already said that climate change is a strategic priority for them in their competition policy. And the European Commission, and again, Maria has mentioned that. And the latest position is set out in the Commission's competition policy in support of Europe's green ambition. And I'll mention that later, the policy brief, as we're now calling it. But don't underestimate, with all this progress, the extent of the opposition. The opposition, I think, is partly from what I know it's crudely called the neoliberal agenda, the Chicago School, whatever you want to call it. But those who have what I would say was perhaps a rather undue faith, a naive faith in the markets can do everything. But the biggest problem for me is the conservative nature of the antitrust establishment. Lawyers, enforcers, everybody involved needs to be bolder in this and to revisit what the law says and look at how it can and should be applied. In my writings, I've looked at how sustainability agreements can avoid being caught by Article 101 and their equivalents in other countries, or be exempted. Now, I'm not going into those, save to say that perhaps I think I set out 5 routes in my paper in the journal, which is in the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement on this topic. But it's the 4 of them, I think, concerned not being caught by Article 101 at all. But the exemption route is perhaps the most topical one, and that is if something is caught by the prohibition on anti-competitive agreements, it may be exemptable. And I'll say something about that in a moment. Well, in fact, I'll turn to that now because it's necessary to understand the issue to say something about the Dutch guidelines, which I've been asked to comment on, and the Commission's policy brief, which is the latest position of the European Commission. Article 101.3 allows, of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, allows agreements to be exempted from Article 101 if 4 conditions are met. I'm not going into all those today, far from it. I'll make a preliminary point, though. I've been at several meetings where people have discussed the exemption, and there's no reference to the law. Even at the World Economic Forum meeting on this, not one lawyer or economist even mentioned what the law was, which has to be the starting point for any analysis here. I want to say something about the first 2 conditions. The first condition for an exemption is that, first one, is that an agreement must contribute to improving the production or distribution of goods or to promoting technical or economic progress. Now, you notice there are 4 limbs to that. Only one of them is economic progress. I mention that because so many people ask the question, can we take non-economic factors into account? Well, first of all, most sustainability arrangements will result in economic progress, I would suggest. But that's not the right question. They don't need to result in economic progress. What about improving production? Agreements to use fewer resources, for example. Improving distribution, sharing distribution logistics, promoting technical progress, developing new green technologies. Those, you don't need to talk about economic or non-economic. Look at what the law actually requires. Many people have written about this, and I particularly commend to you the writings of Maarten Snoep, the head of the Dutch Competition Authority, Maurits Dolmans of Cleary Gottlieb, Dirk Middelschutter of Unilever, and I've written widely on it myself. The Commission, I'm pleased to say, in its recent policy brief, has made good progress in recognising sustainability benefits now. They've recognised qualitative efficiencies like replacing non-sustainable products with sustainable ones, cost efficiencies, reducing plastic packaging or condensing plastic bottles, and even, and this is a development, where consumers appreciate that something's more sustainable. For example, good fair trade coffee from Brazil, rather than something that's been produced on an unfair basis, even if the actual product, when you taste it, may be the same. And then the second issue, and this is where it gets technical, and I apologise to those less familiar with the topic, but it's relevant to the Dutch position. The second point is that the law says that the consumers must get a fair share of the benefits, which I've just referred to. And that gives rise to 2 big questions. Which consumers? Is it just those in the market, as we say? That is, those particular consumers who bought the particular product in question, or consumers more widely? So if a few consumers buy a product which is results from an agreement to produce that product on a more sustainable basis with fewer emissions, a lower carbon footprint, do we just look at the consumers who bought that particular product, or can we look at consumers more widely? And then the second question is, must those consumers who pay what might be a higher price as a result of the agreement be fully compensated, as the Commission policy has suggested from time to time and suggested in the policy brief, or must they just get a fair share of the benefits, which is what the treaty says? It's not me saying that, so those are the words of the treaty. The policy brief recognises, if this is good, that the benefits achieved on separate markets can be taken into account. Well, you should certainly hope so, given the climate crisis, because if agreements result in lower greenhouse gases, for example, everyone, in fact, not just everyone, every living thing on the planet benefits. But the Commission says at the moment that the consumers affected must be substantially the same. In other words, the consumers buying the particular products and the consumers benefiting must be substantially the same. Well, that's not the law. There's no legal authority for that. And I think privately the Commission is admitting that. It's not consistent with cases like the CSED, an agreement where a manufacturer of washing machines agrees to phase out inefficient washing machines, and the Commission recognised even if there weren't benefits to the individual buyers of those washing machines, there were sufficient wider environmental benefits to justify that agreement. And of course, that narrow approach is no way consistent with the Green Deal or the imperatives of the climate crisis. There is some hope. It's possible that if there are a large number of buyers of a product, for example, I don't know, household energy, where there are lots of people who are buying the products which are now greener as a result of the agreement, then maybe if you apply the Commission's approach, that there are enough people getting the benefit to compensate for the costs. But in many instances, perhaps in some of the worst cases, there may be relatively few customers. Example given by Maurits Delmans is that what happens if airlines agree to cooperate to produce greener fuels for aviation? A fantastic initiative if we could get that to work. And the potential benefits would be enormous for everybody. But the people paying for it would be those flying, particularly perhaps those flying business class. Now, there won't be sufficient people paying that extra money for those individuals to be compensated, but that would be to ignore the wider benefits. So it's not clear that that would meet the Commission test, although it seems totally daft to anybody who isn't in what I call the competition bubble. The Dutch guidelines are interesting. They're a compromise. And I think it's important to see the Dutch guidelines as a compromise between the ideal situation and the position that the Commission was in. They make a distinction between environmental damage agreements and other sustainability agreements. Other sustainability agreements are things like dealing with things like working conditions, animal welfare, human rights, social sustainability, etc. For other sustainability agreements, the Dutch, I suspect probably reluctantly, accept that users must be fully compensated by the benefits of the agreements for the harm that they suffer as a result of any restriction of competition. But for environmental damage agreements, this is where we see the initiative. They say that it's not necessary for them to be fully compensated. There, the Dutch take account of benefits other than merely those accruing to the buyers of the product in question. And as they explain, and it's obvious again to anybody outside the competition bubble, this can be fair not to compensate users fully for the harm the agreement causes, because their demand for the products in question essentially creates the problem for which society needs to find solutions. They put that very clearly. And of course, those consumers are also enjoying the benefits in the same way as the rest of society. But two other welcome points from the Dutch guidelines. One is, which is important, I think, for business, and it would be great if other authorities were to follow. They say if business entering into a sustainability agreement follows their guidelines in good faith and publicizes what they're doing, it's not a secret cartel or anything, then they won't be fined, even if the Dutch authorities subsequently disagree with the analysis and don't think an exemption is justified. And the third point, I think, is that there's an intelligent discussion as to when we need to quantify the pros and cons of an agreement. They say an agreement can usually be exempt if there are limited market shares of the parties, or if the harm to competition is based on a rough estimate, evidently smaller than the benefits of the agreement. And as I always say, the valuable things in life don't always need to be reduced to numbers. So my conclusion is that the legal basis and the policy considerations all point towards taking climate change and environmental sustainability into account in any modern competition policy. But sometimes people say, well, Simon, I sympathize with what you're saying, but it's all too difficult. My answer is manifold, but I would say we have to apply the law. It's important that competition law focuses on what's important, and sustainability and climate change is possibly it almost certainly is the most important issue facing mankind at the moment. Otherwise, it risks irrelevance. And any suggestion that it's all too difficult implies that somehow a narrow approach where you reduce everything, and I'm again being simplistic to make the point, you reduce everything to a number of spreadsheets and short-term price considerations, which is of course an oversimplification. But the point I'm making is that competition law under the recent approaches is already complex. And I've been faced in court with 200 pages of econometrics saying one thing and 200 pages of econometrics saying the exact opposite. It's not easy. And balancing different factors is what competition authorities and courts are designed to do. One reason why judges are called judges is that they're called upon to make judgments. And this is an economic approach. I'm in favor of economics. I've got some economics training myself and used it long before competition lawyers were really focused on that. Sometimes it's a more economic approach if you're going to take account of the true cost of production using the latest techniques for environmental economics, but we still need value judgments. And the final comment on this is people say, if we take climate change into account, well, what next? Isn't it a slippery slope? Well, the answer to that is twofold. One, if we're going to single out any one single thing, it has to be climate change. Shouldn't need to emphasize that in the middle of COP26. Secondly, those other factors like the social sustainability issues, I'm not saying they're not important, but I'm saying that they should stand or fall on their own merits, applying the law to particular agreements. But we shouldn't let any difficulties there stand in the way of our fight against climate change. So although I have in my work suggested a few changes to the law, most of what I'm saying can be done within the existing law. We need to just revisit the law and think afresh about our law and economics, and give more, as an antitrust community, give more robust advice. There are technical issues like exactly what is a fair share for consumers. I know that's not easy, but the biggest difficulty, I think, is a somewhat conservative approach to the issue, a closed traditional mindset amongst the antitrust establishment. I certainly have had to change my views since I was in a private practice, when I've had time to step back and think about these issues in a more rounded way. I do believe things are moving in our direction, but there's still a lot to do, and there's a vital role for everybody in the antitrust community to play in it, on which I'll hand back to Maria. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. Now, we will have here Diogo Thomson that will make a comment about this topic, taking account the opinion of the Brazilian Competition Authority.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Maarten, Simon, and Ninette. I will ask your permission to talk in Portuguese because I have an audience all of Brazilian people, so it doesn't make so much sense to talk in English for Brazilian. Então eu vou agora falar em português. Acho que aqui é meu papel aqui. A gente tem 3 professores no assunto, pessoas que são muito mais capacitadas para falar disso, de sustentabilidade e antitruste do que eu. Acho que meu papel aqui é dar uma visão realmente de autoridade antitruste, de como a gente pode ver como um enforcer essas questões. E levando em conta que a gente mora num país que é rico em recursos naturais, então a questão ambiental ela é quase inerente à nossa economia, né? Então, não é raro no CAD que assuntos que haja uma interação entre questões ambientais e o direito antitruste. Minha grande dúvida como autoridade, aqui é uma opinião minha, mas eu acho que reflete bastante o pensamento de hoje do CAD, é até que ponto isso é de fato uma questão antitruste, né? Até que ponto isso é de fato um issue que deve ser tratado pela autoridade antitruste. E olhando assim para o histórico dos casos, a gente tem pelo menos 3 tipos de casos em que ocorre algum tipo de interação entre questões ambientais e o direito antitruste, né? A gente tem um grupo de casos em que a tomada de decisão não é nada influenciada por questões de sustentabilidade ou questões ambientais, mas o motor do negócio analisado pelo CAD é uma questão ambiental. E a gente tem um segundo grupo de casos em que a questão ambiental ela entra numa análise de rivalidade, eficiências e barreiras à entrada. E aí, como qualquer outra questão, e acho que a nossa lei é muito ampla nisso, ela vai ser analisada exatamente com esses critérios, que são critérios típicos da economia e do direito antitruste, e não necessariamente uma inserção de questões de sustentabilidade e de direito ambiental ou de questões de mudanças climáticas na análise antitruste. É uma questão de rivalidade, ela é mais um aspecto econômico que vai ser analisado pela autoridade conforme os critérios tradicionais de análise, principalmente de atos de concentrações, mas também de condutas. E tem um terceiro grupo de casos. Esse terceiro grupo de casos é onde a interação acontece de maneira mais direta e que influencia na tomada de decisão. Esse terceiro grupo de casos talvez mostre para a gente que a autoridade antitruste não é o órgão mais adequado para promover questões de sustentabilidade. Isso não quer dizer que a gente não tenha que entrar na discussão, né? Isso é uma discussão que eu recentemente fiz a contribuição do CAD para o CDE e ainda é muito disputado isso. O Simon mencionou aqui diversas autoridades que avançaram muito no tema, mas existe uma série de outras autoridades que têm muita resistência a esse tema. Mas a questão é a seguinte: a gente não pode esquecer que uma autoridade antitruste ela é parte de uma estrutura de governo. E que questões que importam para a economia e para o desenvolvimento social importam também para a autoridade antitruste. Então, a gente tem um papel, e aí eu acho que a advocacy faz, onde a gente pode entrar melhor nisso, de promover uma economia mais saudável. E uma economia mais saudável hoje é também uma economia que promove sustentabilidade. E o CAD tem um papel nisso. Então, a gente pode, se a questão das empresas de que a competição pode ser um entrave a promover sustentabilidade, o CAD pode entrar nessa discussão, mas ela não vai, acho que não é o mais adequado que a gente entre nessa discussão em casos concretos. Não é o mais adequado, talvez, tratar como uma conduta, alguém que descumpre normas ambientais para ter alguma vantagem competitiva. Existe um órgão no Brasil para isso. Não precisa ser a autoridade antitruste. E, como eu disse, diversas questões ambientais, elas são analisadas pelo CAD dentro da análise tradicional. Então, assim, uma operação que traga eficiências ambientais, como isso é um aspecto econômico, isso vai ser analisado pelo CAD como uma parte das eficiências da operação. Dito isso, eu só vou voltar para os dois casos onde ocorreu uma influência direta de questões ambientais na tomada de decisão do CAD e para um pouco para demonstrar como a experiência não é a melhor, assim, e talvez mostre um pouco a inadequação de você misturar as duas questões diante isso, gente, aí a gente tem que fazer um disclaimer. Isso varia muito do modelo estrutural mesmo de governo de cada país. No Brasil, a gente tem uma estrutura de segmentação de órgãos. Então, a autoridade antitruste ela tem uma competência muito definida por lei, a nossa lei é até relativamente ampla, então ela permite que a gente receba esses inputs que são, em tese, de fora do direito antitruste, mas na verdade eles são aspectos econômicos. Mas existem órgãos para tratar questões ambientais, existem órgãos para tratar questões de tributação e outros temas relacionados a ESG. Falando especificamente dos casos, a gente teve dois casos recentemente. Um deles envolveu uma tragédia ambiental gigantesca que aconteceu no Brasil, que foi o caso de Brumadinho. No período em que ocorreu o rompimento da barragem de Brumadinho, o CAD estava analisando um ato de concentração, especificamente da empresa que era responsável pela barragem. A barragem, só para situar todo mundo, é uma barragem de mineração, né? E que estava comprando uma outra empresa no local onde aconteceu a tragédia da barragem. Era uma operação relativamente simples, não tinha problema concorrencial nenhum, mas a análise da operação coincidiu com a tragédia ambiental. E aí o que aconteceu? Houve uma ação popular que impedia a decisão do CAD. Na verdade, o que aconteceu é que um caso que seria simples, que seria tratado em 15 dias, em um fast track pela autoridade, acabou durando quase o dobro do tempo, só por conta desse elemento que não tinha nada a ver com antitruste, mas que foi circunstancial, coincidente, e que acabou tendo que ser levado em conta na análise do caso. Então, de uma certa forma, você impediu ali um negócio que era válido, que era legítimo. Impediu não, porque no final ele aconteceu, mas durante algum tempo ele foi obstacularizado por conta de uma questão que era estranha ao próprio negócio em si, e que obviamente, não dava para negar, né? Foi uma tragédia, enfim, de proporções imensas, então a gente também não tem um certo senso de responsabilidade de olhar com mais cuidado a operação, ainda que isso não seja objeto da análise, mas foi uma influência direta na tomada de decisão e que fez o caso demorar. E o segundo caso é um caso muito interessante, porque aconteceu no Paraná, que é um estado aqui do Brasil, e existe um mercado de extração de areia, né, que é feito diretamente dos rios. E por conta de uma necessidade de se adequar a regras ambientais, o Ministério Público local obrigou as empresas a formarem uma associação para conseguir cumprir determinadas regras de meio ambiente. E aí vem aquela situação que acontece muito quando a gente olha para os cartéis de crise que são vistos mundo afora, né? A associação começou para conseguir que as empresas cumprissem as normas ambientais, mas ela virou um cartel de preço tradicional, cartel mais de livro-texto que existe. E isso chegou ao CAD, só que eles estavam cumprindo a determinação de um outro órgão público, né? Então, no final, o conselheiro, na época, o conselheiro Márcio Oliveira fez acabou que a decisão foi um acordo, existia uma discussão ali de inexigibilidade de conduta diversa, né, de você estar cumprindo a decisão de um órgão e descumprindo a de outro, e no final, talvez seja a única decisão do CAD em que existe um elemento ambiental dentro. E nesse acordo, um dos termos do acordo, existe uma obrigação de vocês podem se reunir para cumprir as normas ambientais, desde que vocês tratem disso e sigam determinadas normas de compliance. Por que eu mencionei esses dois casos? Estou mencionando isso porque, de alguma forma, eles demonstram que a questão de sustentabilidade chega à autoridade, independentemente da nossa opinião, se isso é uma questão ou não. Mas normalmente, as autoridades antitruste, elas têm os meios de tratar isso dentro do direito antitruste, dentro da economia, da concorrência, sem precisar entrar em questões, e isso talvez seja a grande crítica, que ela não é capacitada para fazer, que é discutir se você tem que tomar determinado caminho ou não para promover maior sustentabilidade. Então, assim, de novo, assim, e talvez seja a mensagem que eu queira deixar, a gente não vai, acho que como autoridade, a gente não pode fugir da discussão. A gente não pode deixar de tratar sustentabilidade como um tema importante. Mas talvez a gente não seja o órgão mais adequado para promover a sustentabilidade. Mas a gente é um órgão importante para ser ouvido, porque a gente é importante que concorrência seja um valor de política econômica e que a política econômica do futuro promova valores ambientais.
Obrigada, Diogo. Let's move now to Maarten.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thanks for having me on this panel. It is a pity to not be able to be in Brazil. Actually, I recall vividly traveling with CADE and several people, both in Rio and Brasilia in 2017. That was a very enjoyable event. And I would love to have been in Sao Paulo today, because I suppose that's where you are, right? Where the table is. Yeah. Now, my Portuguese is a bit rusty. Actually, I don't get much further than saying hello to my 10-year-old capoeira teacher every Saturday morning. So it was a bit hard for me to now know what the position of the Brazilian Competition Authority on this very important subject is. But I'm in a position to comment and criticize Simon. And actually, Simon and I have been in a variety of circles. I'm also in his book that he showed with a critical paper that I've asked the organization to circulate, actually, and in particular to circulate an updated version, because there's so much going on in this domain, with the Commission in September taking a position against the Dutch forerunning, actually, concerning the stretching of the fair share. There it is. Yeah, it's now called More Friendly Fire online, but I'll distribute it in the chat in a moment. So this is a very important subject. And it's a beautiful area of debate between law and economics. I fully share the importance that Simon has stressed and the urgency of doing something about climate change. I'm a big fan myself of the Commission's Green Deal, which of course the driving force behind is my countryman Frans Timmermans, of whom I'm also a personal supporter. And so we're not debating at all about the difficulties and the importance that we are facing in transiting in our economies to more sustainable ways of production. Not at all. Also, we do not disagree on the matter whether, for example, we can quantify, or to what extent we must quantify in economics, the cost and benefits of environmental measures. We can do that. It's a large area, environmental economics, that's very sophisticated. And also, therefore, we're able to, for example, know that the current price on the emissions trading markets of a ton of CO2 emissions reductions is much too low compared to the social value of it. And so OECD publishes in this regard important tables of what the social values are, and those are very, very much higher than the actual prices. And so these kinds of calculations we can do as well. Where we disagree, and Simon has narrowed down the discussion already to 101, where we disagree. So again, as an aside, I think there's fantastically important things to be done in state aid, an area of competition policy, where, because absolutely these are public economics kinds of problems, where states have to come into play, not only with regulation, where I indeed will also comment at some point later, but also just helping firms with investing in these kinds of transitions, because it's public goods aspects that are at play here, very, very fundamentally. It's about externalities, and that's where governments have a role rather than corporates, actually, and that's where we disagree. So in state aid and also in public procurement that Simon raised, those are areas where competition policy can do a lot, and we should think about helping states in particular to help their companies to transit to more sustainable ways of production. But where we disagree is in the area where Simon put the focus already, and rightly so, the area that's being hotly debated, and that's the area of exempting sustainability agreements from cartel law under European Treaty Article 1013, or any member state, or I'm sure also Portuguese variations of this kind of exemption clauses. And the key thing there is that from an economic point of view, even though it is a sympathetic idea to allow companies to make agreements, from an economic point of view, the incentives are just not right. Okay, so when you think about these beautiful ideas that these firms have, or plans and proposals that they make in their submissions also to the European Commission's conference, for example, that we had in February, all these proposals, they might sound right, but the companies simply do not have the right incentives to really do something about sustainability. So all these calls for collaborative this and collaborative that, they overlook very much the fact that the incentives have to be right. And so therefore, we have to be very, very careful if we're going to look at competition policy measures in this domain, what the right measures are. And they are not coming out of all economic research, almost all economic research in this domain, and they are not by allowing companies to make agreements. And that's where I think the ambitious and also sympathetic ideas of a number of lawyers that are pushing this simply go wrong. And they should carefully think about, is this really the way in which we're going to support sustainability? And there's lots and lots of reasons to think that they're not. So let me make that a little bit more precise in a few minutes. But again, I've written several papers on this because, as mentioned, the Dutch where you can look up the literature, you can look up the models, you can look up the empirical research that has been done in this domain. Even some experimental research is now ongoing, and all of it finds quite consistently that sustainability is supported by companies in competition more than when they make agreements. So the more competition, the more sustainability. Now, that might still be way too little sustainability, and I fully agree with Simon that more should be done. But if you're going to get less when you're going to allow exemptions, that's just a step in the wrong direction. And that's where my warnings apply. So as said, several years of research have gone into this already, several papers, because the Dutch Competition Authority is a forerunner in this domain, and essentially because the Dutch were confronted with two cases, the chicken of tomorrow case and the coal case or the energy agreement case in the Netherlands, two early cases where the Dutch Competition Authority said no to horizontal agreements between corporations that said that they were going to increase the living conditions of chicken in the chicken case, or that they were going to reduce CO2 emissions in the coal case. And the reason that the Dutch Competition Authority said no in those two cases was because there was just too little green done. The sustainability, and sustainability is a very broad subject, and the chicken case is a complicated case because it involves how people feel about the well-being of farm animals, of poultry, of chicken, which is a complicated thing, but not for an economist. And we can think about this conceptually and also in terms of how people value this and so on. But it's more sophisticated maybe than when you're just talking about, still not just as a bit, when you're talking about environmental damage, CO2 emissions reductions, for example. But in both cases, the key point was that the parties that wanted an exemption from the horizontal from the cartel prohibition, essentially, were just doing too little. And if we focus on the coal case, that was an agreement amongst 5 electricity producers in the Netherlands that all the Dutch would essentially be dealing with. And the agreement was to close down coal-fired electricity plants, which would essentially eliminate 10%, reduce electricity production capacity in the Netherlands by 10%. Now, that sounds very sympathetic again. And of course, it was sold by the parties as a CO2 emissions reduction scheme. But really, it wasn't, because what happened was that electricity prices would go up by quite a bit. And the Dutch Competition Authority carefully calculated by how much. There was also some savings in fine particles emissions and reductions in fine particles emissions and so on that the Dutch Competition Authority also calculated the social value of. And that's where the environmental economics came in. But then on the point of the CO2 emissions reductions, what actually happened was that these coal-fired electricity plants, that they would close down their plants, but then they would sell their rights for CO2 emissions on the open market, on the European emissions trading system, or they wouldn't buy rights to leave the rights in the system. And so ultimately what would happen was that these rights would be purchased by somebody else. And so the CO2 emissions would just be relocated from the Netherlands to, who knows, maybe Germany. And since this is a worldwide problem, there wouldn't be any CO2 emissions reduction. And when the electricity companies were asked, actually it was the first thing that I suggested to the Dutch Competition Authority, asked these electricity companies to buy these rights or keep these rights and burn those rights so that the rights are being taken out of the system and that there would actually be a CO2 emissions reduction. Then the electricity companies refused to do this. And they said, well, who's going to pay for it? That's going to be too expensive. We don't want to buy these rights. We want to sell those rights, depending on who has the right, because they represent the monetary value. So clearly they weren't really willing to go, the last mile and do the actual CO2 emissions reduction because they thought it was too costly. And it's exactly consistent with the theory and the empirical research and everything that I already alluded to and that I'll make a little bit more concrete next. Okay? So the key thing is that the presumption under the green antitrust movement, by which I now mean particularly this idea to exempt horizontal agreements from cartel law, the presumption is that restrictions of competition would somehow stimulate sustainability initiatives. Okay? And that's just not right. Now, that's not to say that there's not a conflict between competition and sustainability. Okay, that's exactly the sentiment that Simon is referring to. Right? The idea that companies, for example, because they want to cut costs and so on, that they are in a position that they are pollutive, that they don't pay for their pollution because they create this classic externality issue because they can freely pollute, or they can pollute very cheaply relative to the social cost of it. This is a classic. The light just turned off, but that's fine. So this is a classic problem in economics. It's public economics 101, that if there are externality problems, so in particular, if the pollution, if something is polluted by factories, by firms, such as the river or the air, that is not priced in then firms will do too much pollution, too much production. And the way to solve it is to internalize these externalities by making sure that the companies do have to pay for their pollution. And so what you do is you introduce, for example, these emissions tradings markets, and then ideally with so few rights that the prices are high, and there's just too much supply of rights in these markets. That's a problem. Economists have identified this, and we also have ways to solve it. But certainly that's different and more effective than this particular trajectory that we're talking about now. Or you introduce, for example, carbon taxation. So carbon taxes, also something that almost all economists worldwide subscribe to, is a very, very good idea. But it's just not being implemented to a sufficient extent. And that's where we have to go to politicians and lobby with politicians for this kind of implementation, of course. So there certainly is pollution caused by production, and competition leads to low price and large volume production, and therefore also increases this kind of pollution compared to maybe a monopolist who would restrict output. Okay, that has all sorts of other downsides. That's why we don't like it. The solution is not to restrict competition. The solution is to introduce pricing on these externality aspects, for example, through carbon, or for example, through all sorts of taxes and subsidies, and maybe also in the state aid domain, help companies transit to more cleaner ways of production by subsidizing those transits, for example. Okay? But the idea that if you're just going to restrict competition amongst the companies, now they're going to invest more in sustainable production. So now they're going to invest in these very expensive transitions to cleaner production methods. That's just not going to happen. And what evidence do I have for that? Well, there is a large literature, as I mentioned, that looks at corporate social responsibility taking, for example, and a part of it in journals like Management Science and so on, and the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, or the Journal of Economics and Management Science, of Management Strategy, all these kinds of top journals. There's lots and lots of literature by very, very well-established researchers like Flammer, for example, or Servaz, and so on. Many people have put out empirical research where they looked at the relationship between competition and corporate social responsibility. For example, what happens if a border opens up and now there's competition between Northern America and Canada? What happens to the investments that companies do in corporate social responsibility taking, including fair wages but also just more cleaner production? So all these things that sustainability, the proponents of sustainability are in favor of, and I'm one of those. Now, what happens is that this competition, increases in competition, drives firms to do more green, to take more corporate social responsibility, to take sustainability measures. Why is this? Because consumers have a willingness to pay for green, even though this might be a small and little willingness to pay, and companies therefore see this as a competition dimension. And so they go and invest, and then they clean up their act in order to steal business from their rivals. And whenever there is just the slightest willingness to pay, companies will do more in competition than when they can make agreements. And if there's no willingness to pay at all, then they will do just as much in competition as they will do in coordination, because then there's just cost and there's no benefits, and also a horizontal agreement amongst companies will deliver nothing. So empirically, theoretically, experimentally, there's all this research that shows that competition is the driver of green, not enough, because we need to do taxation and we need to do subsidies and everything. And we need to get the government involved in regulation, not enough, but more than when you're going to allow horizontal agreements. And that is the proposal. So before we go and delve into all these, how should we stretch the fair share criterion and everything? Can we exempt it under the law? What is actually the law? And I looked in all of those things and also into the cases. Like the Sachet case that Simon mentioned. But we should also maybe look at consumer detergents, which is a case that went bust. And certainly the AdBlue case or the car battery case, or a variety of cases where indeed we've seen that when companies get together, they do very little on green. They do less than they would otherwise have done. And they're going to raise prices to their own benefit. Now, and it's not orthodox economics or Chicago or conservative. It's just economics 101 that you think about what are the incentives of companies. And so what we do in a theory paper that we just revised again and put out in full form on SSRN, which is called Joint Corporate Social Responsibility by Joint Agreement, we make a model that's a very standard IO model where companies can decide on their investments in corporate social responsibility. So that would be green, or could also be something else like animal welfare, or fair trade conditions, for example, for their suppliers, like no child labor, or fair wages for farmers in developing countries. So firms invest in this in stage one. Then there's a second stage where they compete in prices or quantities. That doesn't really matter. And then we look at what kind of agreement would actually stimulate corporate social responsibility taking. Now, and strikingly, the kind of agreement that creates the least stimulus for corporate social responsibility is an agreement on corporate social responsibility standards itself. And the reason is that these are costly things to do. And so what the firms will do is, if they know that they will be competing in the second stage, then they will try to limit their investments, because they will never be able to recoup those investments in the second stage. They're going to save on those transition costs. And therefore, they're going to do less. They're going to just do a little bit if they're required by competition authority, for example, under Article 101(3) type of compensation requirement, whatever that is. But the thinner you make the requirement, the thinner is going to be the green. That's exactly what we mean by cartel greenwashing. You put these companies in a position to do very little green, only the green that's really required, to the extent that the competition authority can monitor it actually. And they will not do more because they're going to try to save on that investment. The only type of agreement that does generate corporate social responsibility investments, interestingly enough, is not an agreement on sustainability, but an agreement on quantity or price. So a hardcore cartel that focuses only on the price, but not on the sustainability. That's beautiful. We could maybe talk about exempting those. That's not a proposal. Nobody wants to touch that so far. But that's actually an agreement that does increase investments in sustainability. And the reason is that now firms, they compete still on the green dimension. So they try to attract customers, even at the smallest willingness to pay, they try to attract customers by being the greener product. So they compete there and they do more because they are in competition. And they are interested in that because then in the second stage, where they have a cartel agreement on quantities, there's going to be a large price. And so the larger their customer base is, the larger the share that they take from the price cartel in the second stage. So that will be a way in which we could stimulate sustainability. However, as said, nobody has proposed that, and maybe rightly so, because consumers are going to be harmed quite a bit, very, very much. And also the total welfare is going down because there's going to be deadweight losses. So the companies cannot compensate consumers either. And total welfare is lower. So it's not a good idea from that point of view either. But it's the only type of cartel horizontal agreement that's going to lead to more green. And the policy paradox simply is, and I've now said that several times, that competition is a stronger driver of green than collusion. Now, why is this important, and why am I advocating, bringing this message in these platforms time and again? Even though I've written my papers, it's all out there, because I see some real risks. I mean, we are, as said, I think it's a very, very important subject, sustainability. We need to do something. There's an existential threat here, and I sympathize very, very strongly with Simon. But the tool is just not right. It's actually a dangerous tool. Because if we're going to allow these horizontal agreements, we're going to get less green, and we'll never know actually what would have been the but for green if we would just have left the whole thing alone and let companies compete. Okay. And also, if you look at the initiatives that are being proposed, like Unilever's initiatives, they're not ambitious at all. They're very, very small advances having to do with smaller packages and small things. Whereas, the real ambition should be, we should be pushing our governments to put in place regulation to just rule out chicken harm to farm animals, to just close down those coal burning electricity plants by regulation, or introduce carbon taxation. So cartel greenwashing is a real risk, I think. But the second real risk, and then I'll come to an end, but the second real risk is why this is dangerous is because I've seen now that governments, so those are the parties that should do something, that governments see this development as a way to shirk on their responsibility. Okay? Because they say, well, businesses are taking care of it. So we've told the community to do self-regulation. And so we can just step away and let the companies deal with it. They have the superior information, and yes, they do. They know how to not torture animals, and they know how to put filters on their production processes, but they don't have the incentive. That's the problem. And so governments are going to shirk on their task to take responsibility for this problem, which is, and they're the first party
to do this. And so this is exactly what happened in the very first case, the chicken case. Okay, the Dutch government didn't want to regulate it, so they threw it over the hedge to the competition authority, let the companies deal with it. And then what did the companies propose? Well, we're just going to improve the living conditions of chicken for consumption in the Netherlands, not the export chicken, which is 70-80% of the chicken grown in the Netherlands are for export purposes. We don't want regulation. The sector really quickly recognized this, because regulation, which would say that you should treat your animals right, would also apply to all the chicken for export. Okay, but they didn't want that, because then they would, have higher prices and that would hurt their export. So they just wanted to self-regulate it for the small amount of chicken that were grown for the Dutch consumption market. Okay, and when I found out about this and said this in one of the first conferences in the Netherlands about this, immediately the animal rights activist movement started scratching their head and said, well, wait a minute, that's not what we had in mind. We want all the chicken to have better living conditions. Okay, and so they stepped away from this route and they forgot about it. But it's back again on an international scale for sustainability, but it's the same problem. Governments are going to shirk, they're going to step away and say, well, the firms are taking care of it by self-regulation, but that self-regulation is going to be super suboptimal, much more suboptimal, third best compared to what governments do, which is also suboptimal. I see that, but that's where we should focus our energy, lobbying and arguing for taxation, subsidies, and the whole. Okay, so I conclude that the green cartel exemption policy is very sympathetic. The objectives are sympathetic, but it's counterproductive, and that's because so far there's too little regards for the problems with incentives. We should engage in this debate. And Maurits Dolmans, for example, who Simon also mentioned several times, he's been following our work. We've been discussing this, and still we don't get to the core of it. And the core are the incentives right? Now, there might be situations where the incentives could be there, but they require a whole lot of spillovers. There's a little bit of advance now because some other economists are getting into the debate. There's a beautiful Oxera paper coming out. They're looking at spillover effects. I won't get into the technical details, but if you would extend our model in that direction, which is what Oxera is doing, then but I think you really need to have heroic spillover. So that's not going to really cut the mustard, I'm afraid. But then there might be situations where this works. But okay, let's have the debate about whether those situations are there. I think at the moment, no, but that's at least productive. Okay. And if we keep looking at the legal aspects of this without thinking about whether these companies are really going to do something on their promise, then we have greenwashing, we will have government shirking, competition authorities losing a lot of resources on this, also when they're going to allow all of this. Yeah, I need to conclude, I see that. So the competition authorities are going to lose a lot of resources on this because they will need to monitor this in order to make the cartel greenwashing a minimum and so on. And so, that's just a waste of resources on a very, very important goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maarten. It was very interesting to hear another point of view. So it's good to have this two different, and also the vision here from Brazilian Competition Authority. Thank you very much. And now let's go to Ninette.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for this very kind invitation, of course, yourself, Maria, and Renata for pulling together this particular panel. I would also like to thank Simon, Maarten, and the Brazilian Competition Authority for very insightful comments as well on this important topic. Sort of coming last in the panel, there's been a lot said, and I'd like to infuse my observations with what I would call some real world experience, real world thinking, if I may. And there may be a bit of a critique, perhaps of Maarten, perhaps of Simon, but I would suggest potentially mostly of some of the comments Maarten has made, just based on experience and just based on the practical challenges and difficulties that certainly my clients talk to me about in the context of the sustainability debate. Of course, all the comments I make are personal, and shouldn't be attributed to Freshfields, my firm, or to any of my clients. And so to contextualize this real world view, I'd like to talk about three core things, and they touch on a number of the points that Simon and Maarten made. The first one is, what do we mean by sustainability? The second is, why do companies want or need to collaborate, and why allow them? And it speaks to the incentives point that Maarten made. And then some of the challenges and limitations around competition law policy. I'd like to say a few words on that, and then conclude with some suggestions as to how businesses can be supported by policymakers, by competition authorities, and by governments. So to my first observation, what do we mean by sustainability? Maarten and Simon have, I think, rightfully honed in on climate change. But I wanted to start with this rather esoteric question, because I do think it's important that there is a degree of alignment on the parameters of the discussion. Like many practitioners in the audience or listening in online, I advise companies in different parts of the world. And what I found is that the nature of the sustainability debate actually differs across geographies. Europe is certainly leading the charge as far as climate change is concerned. Simon and Maarten both mentioned the Dutch authority, the UK, the Greeks, France, Belgium. Even the Germans have also written some very interesting insights on topic. And then, of course, there's the European Commission. In the US, we see somewhat of a more muted response to the debate on sustainability and competition law. In Asia, where I'm based, competition authorities are certainly live to the debate on sustainability, and including the role that competition law can play to promote sustainability. But we've yet to see some guidance on topic. And I would suggest that actually the thrust of the debate on sustainability in Asia, at the risk of generalizing and oversimplifying things, is actually rather focused, not so much on collaboration, on competitor cooperation, but rather on how to report sustainability claims, disclosure requirements, supply chain issues, labor issues, and governance. In other words, societal and governance issues and less environmental issues have played an important role so far. I think the COVID-19 response signaled the willingness to consider broader sustainability issues, with several competition authorities such as China, India, Hong Kong, and Singapore, to name but a few, introducing advisories indicating where antitrust rules can be relaxed to deal with the health crisis, whilst remaining tough on hardcore restraints. My own view is that if the sustainability net is actually cast too wide, one runs the risk of alienating sections of society because there is no commonality necessarily in terms of the scope of sustainability, nor on the specific issues that regulation, businesses, and/or governments should necessarily address. And I also think that it makes it potentially a lot easier for policymakers to shy away from taking the targeted and much needed action to address the climate emergency that we currently face. As I mentioned, I thought it was important to underline that because the focus has been very much on climate change, which I also agree is important. But in discussing these issues, particularly in areas or geographies where the debate is not as developed as in Europe, it is important to take into account that sustainability is not necessarily all things to all men in terms of devising policy, in terms of the debate. Secondly, to the incentives point that Maarten spent a lot of time talking on, which I fully respect and understand where he's coming from. So why do companies want to collaborate? Why allow them? And do they genuinely have an incentive in terms of the sustainability initiatives? Maarten suggested that incentives are not right. I beg to differ, if I may, because my experience, at least for the clients that I'm advising day to day, they are corporations who are actively seeking to push forward the sustainability agenda, not because of regulation a lot of the time, but because of their own employees, because of the consumers who are voting with their feet, and because of their recognition of the importance of corporate responsibility in our environment today. My personal view is that the dynamic as far as corporate responsibility has changed enormously, particularly because companies today, particularly listed companies, are being challenged about sustainability claims that they are making. And that in and of itself certainly incentivizes companies to strive towards obtaining and achieving sustainability. Secondly, I think it's important to keep in mind, obviously, that governments and policymakers around the globe are certainly seeking to tackle the climate emergency and advocating ambitious sustainability goals. So in this context, I agree, as Maarten and Simon mentioned, regulation has an important role to play, such as setting minimum standards for sustainability goals. However, my experience has been that regulation can sometimes be insufficient. It can be slow, limited in geographic reach, and not least sometimes due to comity considerations. And there is clearly and can be inconsistency across jurisdictions. And it's really the slow pace of change that a number of my clients are seeing, which is driving them to consider sustainability cooperation, including amongst competitors. Clearly, a number of my clients are certainly doing things on their own and doing so unilaterally. But the challenge that they face is really the limitations around government regulation, government action, and first mover disadvantages or other market failures. So trying to find solutions for large scale problems or challenges like deforestation, like pollution, or desiring to meet the net zero targets set by governments is a challenge. And I would suggest it's actually quite difficult to seek to achieve that absent industry-wide collaboration. Companies may also want to collaborate to meet and exceed these targets set by regulators, or by regulation in particular, or to work together to push for higher sustainability standards. Certainly that's what my clients are telling me, and I have really no basis to challenge that as such. So companies are, across industries, I'm finding, are increasingly seeking to work together to achieve these sustainability objectives. Examples where further collaboration would be helpful, and where I've seen companies consult me about, would be in the area, for example, say joint research into less polluting technologies, committing to minimum standards for manufacturing, agreeing to phase out less sustainable but cheaper products and replacing them with more sustainability alternatives. There are other examples, and we can debate about those. But where there's also agreement and understanding is that these sorts of initiatives can and almost certainly will have a negative impact on consumer choice and or prices in the short term. And therefore, they are at risk of falling foul of the competition laws and rules. I think in this context, this is where there is this recognition that competition law can have the effect of actually hindering rather than promoting sustainability initiatives. And that's certainly why my sense is that it's important that some relaxation of the antitrust rules is warranted to allow for such competitor collaboration to achieve sustainability goals. This is not to say at all, and this is not to encourage a pass for companies that are engaging in clearly anti-competitive initiatives. under the guise of sustainability. So this is not advocating greenwashing by any stretch of the imagination. There's also recognition, or at least there must be or should be a recognition, that there's a heck of a lot today that companies can do within the strictures of competition laws as they currently stand. So, for example, non-binding sustainability targets or codes, government petitioning, which is lawful in some jurisdictions but can cause issues in other jurisdictions, joint actions to develop new products or markets, provided appropriate guardrails are in place to prevent anti-competitive conduct, agreements where there's no market power. And I think critically as well, collaborations where the pro-competitive benefits clearly outweigh the anti-competitive effects. And if one breaks that down a bit, perhaps picking up on some of the points that Simon made earlier, the question for authorities is to test and assess what is the purpose of the relevant collaboration. Is it improving production, for example? Is it lending or contributing to the use of more sustainable solutions? Is it promoting greener technologies? And indeed, the question then, which I think there's a heavy debate on that, is will consumers get a fair share of the resulting benefit? And I'll come back to that in terms of some of the challenges for competition law. And the importance of ensuring that any such collaboration is not unduly restrictive in engendering the pro-competitive benefits of the relevant agreement. But companies have a genuine concern that competition law today can and does have this chilling effect on collaborator actions. And to my final point, in terms of some of the challenges ahead, I think whether an agreement, whether cooperation, collaboration infringes competition law or not, is generally assessed by considering its impact on consumer welfare. Competition law has traditionally focused almost entirely on the strict economic impact, i.e. prices of an agreement on current consumers of products directly covered by the joint initiative. There's been little consideration about broader and longer term environmental or societal effects. And the question clearly does arise, which consumers must be shown to benefit? And that is a challenge that I think competition authorities need to address. Should the sustainability benefits or efficiencies accrue to the same consumers, i.e. the immediate purchases of a product? Or can consumers in this context include broader society? What about future consumers? Should consumers include those based in other jurisdictions? How does one deal with comity considerations? In other words, should out-of-market efficiencies be taken into account? And how should antitrust authorities weigh future cost decreases against current price increases? How should one quantify sustainability benefits? These are all questions, I think, that competition authorities will need to address and policymakers will need to address. So to conclude, I think what companies are looking for is not these sorts of debates about, what is sustainability, the constraints one has from competition law policy, the issues around incentives. I think it's quite simple. Companies are basically saying, we do not think that in the present environment to achieve sustainability goals set by governments, prescribed by regulation, is such that we feel we can achieve that acting on our own. And therefore, we would welcome the possibility for collaboration. And I would suggest that if that is true, and if that one takes that at face value, then what one needs are really guidelines from the competition authorities. Guidelines which indicate and help companies understand what kinds of sustainability agreements would normally not give rise to competition concerns. And in this respect, the Dutch Competition Authority has gone a long way in providing such guidance. Guidance which addresses the kinds of efficiencies that competition authorities will take into account. Guidance that goes into what sorts of qualitative and quantitative approaches competition authorities will employ. What kinds of econometric studies authorities will focus on. Secondly, I do think that it would be helpful to encourage the increased use of comfort letters or business review letters for those who are more familiar with the US context, in order to assure companies that when they do engage in these collaborative efforts, they will not be penalized necessarily for engaging in conduct that is perceived to be anti-competitive, if there is clear evidence of a sustainability objective in mind. Again, it's not a pass for companies to engage in greenwashing, but rather it is a recognition that we are facing a climate challenge. We are facing a climate emergency, which requires extreme measures to be taken within the confines of competition law. And in that context, I think it would be helpful as well if competition authorities, much like the Dutch have encouraged, to allow immunity from fines for sustainability initiatives. And finally, I would add that I think it will be helpful and important that there is increased international engagement and cooperation amongst competition authorities to ensure that there is as much cross-border policy consistency and cross-agency cooperation as possible. In the interest of time, let me pause there and hand back to you, Maria Cecilia.
Okay. Thank you, Ninette, for giving us how the companies are seeing this topic and how they're addressing. It was very, very interesting. I would like if the audience that is here want to make any questions, you can do directly to the panelists. Just check here. So here in the Q&A, we don't have any questions. So I will make the questions. After all of the debate here, hearing different opinions, different points of view, and also this vision of the cooperation, and what is the role of cooperation between different agencies? The agencies that decide to apply sustainability, and there are others that they didn't decide yet, as Maarten said. And also we are curious about the US, how the US authorities are, if they are discussing, if there is any indication of interest to participate in discussion of this topic. Ninette, could you address that, or?
Yes, certainly. I'm happy to give that to offer some observations on that, not least because I mentioned international cooperation. I think international cooperation is critical. Having said that, though, however, I do think that there isn't sufficient, there aren't sufficient examples, real world examples of sustainability arrangements, particularly of a cross-border nature. And so my sense is that is, as a result of that, I do think that there has not been as much cooperation as there could otherwise have been. Having said that, though, there are organizations like the OECD where there have been discussions. There's the ICN where there have been discussions. So it certainly is a live debate at the moment. And I would certainly welcome considerable more international cooperation in this area. As far as I'm aware, I think certainly the US agencies, those who drive policy debates, are certainly live to the debate. But again, I would say it's really Europe that has been leading on this whole topic around sustainability.
Would you see any possibility under US antitrust for these kinds of exemptions?
Well, I think so. Having said that, though, I think the courts have basically said that competition law is really or should be understood in the context of consumer welfare. So for as long as we have arrangements which at their heart, protect consumer welfare, I would see no real reason why it would be difficult or impossible for US law to apply in this context. But there have been a couple of instances involving business review letters, which can be used as a method for the US agencies to assess collaborative efforts. So my view is that there is certainly no real reason why that would not be the case at all. I was involved earlier this year in an ABA, American Bar Association working group where there were lots of different people from different jurisdictions, including those from the US, and there were very lively debates. And I think fundamentally, and I think that's the key point here, there is a lot that one can do within the current confines of antitrust law, whether in the US, whether in Europe, or in Asia.
I would add, if I made two points to that. One is a general one, and that is that this is a relatively new topic. Maria quite rightly referred to the 2012 initiative of the Dutch, but that was almost like a voice in the dark. This debate has really only been active in the last 2 years. When I was briefly a non-governmental advisor to DG Comp in Brussels, one of my first questions was, is this being discussed at the ICN? And the answer was no, it didn't fall within any of their working groups. About the only thing I think I ever did in the ICN was to encourage other people to get it onto the agenda, and it clearly is on the agenda. So I think it's spreading out from Europe, and that takes time. Secondly, a US specific one, which is very much conjecture, I accept. The US antitrust is changing very fast at the moment with the appointment of President Biden, the election of President Biden, the appointment of Nina Khan to chair the FTC. Things are changing very fast. Top of their agenda have been things like challenging big mergers, big tech, the platform issues. I think that it can't be, given that speed of change, they're not going to stand aside from an international debate as important as this one. So I would expect action in the States within the next year. But that's conjecture on my part.
Okay, considering you make a comment about ICN, the special project, Simon, what do you think there will be the next steps there? Did the authorities make any commitment at this point? Or it was just discussions and the conclusions of the report?
Sorry, do you mean at the ICN level or more generally? Sorry, I've no further information. I always make a joke that I was sacked as a non-governmental advisor to the European Commission, when sadly I was no longer considered to be a European citizen with Brexit. But so I can't comment on the ICN. I think the next most important step, though, in this debate is what the Commission next does in relation to its horizontal guidelines. There is an indication in its recent policy brief, which we have discussed, but that is not set in stone. And I know that there are debates within the European Commission, because individuals within the European Commission don't necessarily agree on this, but that's the most important single step. The Dutch, people have mentioned the Dutch, but ultimately the Dutch realize that they are one country within the EU, and they always call their guidelines draft guidelines, because what they were trying to do was to influence the debate, and what they really want is the Commission to adopt guidelines consistent with the Dutch guidelines. There is some scope for individual countries to do things, but it is limited within the European Union. For example, the Austrians have recently amended their law to explicitly say that where an agreement has a substantial contribution, and I'm paraphrasing now, to climate change and sustainability, then that will be recognized as a benefit to consumers. But the most important initiative is at the European level.
Okay, thank you. I think we are very close to end the panel. If you want to make any final remarks, please feel free. Ninette? Oh, you have a question. Oh, we have a question from the audience here.
Obrigado a todos pela palestra, excelente. Vou fazer a pergunta em português, um pouco dirigida ao Diogo, mas também aos nossos amigos estrangeiros. Eu tenho visto duas situações, eu tenho pensado em duas situações no qual a sustentabilidade pode entrar na análise de antitrust, em termos práticos, né? A primeira, eu acabei de ler as notícias da COP26, no sentido de que as empresas estão fazendo acordos para não comprar soja ou outros produtos de empresas que desmatam ou de empresas que produzem em áreas ambientalmente sensíveis. Então, a primeira pergunta seria se os palestrantes veem nisso um acordo ilegal que poderia ser visto como um acordo de compras e, assim, haveria uma infração concorrencial, uma infração antitrust. A segunda pergunta, em relação a concentrações, assim como na legislação europeia que o Simon comentou, nós temos o nosso guia de análise de concentrações horizontais, e também está na lei da defesa da concorrência, que os atos podem ser aprovados em função das eficiências. Até hoje, todas as eficiências que apareceram ou foram analisadas foram eficiências meramente econômicas, e a minha dúvida se, aí Diogo, se você já pensou nisso, se a legislação atual brasileira, o artigo 88, parágrafo 6º da lei, por exemplo, autorizaria a aprovação de uma operação com base em eficiências ambientais, ainda que não cumpra aqueles requisitos previstos no guia de análise de concentrações horizontais.
Eu posso fazer um complemento à sua pergunta?
Por favor.
E esses acordos que você mencionou são acordos internacionais?
Eu vi hoje, li hoje que foi na COP26 entre grandes empresas que consomem cerca de 30% da soja mundial ou algo assim. Não envolveu as tradings, pelo que eu entendi, mas os produtores de alimentos. Não sei se as trades estão envolvidas, mas enfim, é um acordo que foi anunciado.
Sim.
Com esse sentido. A mesma coisa você pode ter para não comprar gado de área desmatada ou gado no estado A ou no estado B. Esse, para os colegas estrangeiros, essa é uma discussão tremenda aqui no Brasil atualmente.
Eu queria só... o pedido foi realmente para entender se, eventualmente, são acordos que vão demandar cooperação internacional entre as autoridades e aquela autoridade que já está admitindo o uso da sustentabilidade como critério de análise e aquela que não está. Quer dizer, a gente vai começar a ter conflitos aí, enfim, se vocês puderem comentar.
Foram essas duas situações
fáceis, né?
Percebi.
Bem fácil.
Bem tranquilo.
Tranquilas. Embora inéditas.
Eu vou tentar iniciar e depois eu deixo para os professores complementar. Com relação ao acordo, acho que é importante dar um passo atrás e dizer que o tema, embora ele é um tema recente e que vem sendo debatido na SN e na OCDE de maneira bastante profunda. Assim, as autoridades têm discutido essa questão da sustentabilidade, pelo menos há uns 2 anos, de maneira muito mais, enfim, detida, né, digamos assim. E aí, o que a gente consegue dizer hoje é que não existe um consenso. Não existe um consenso, existe, na verdade, muita dúvida e muita aversão ao risco, que foram os riscos colocados hoje pelo Maarten, de que você, enfim, ao mesmo tempo em que a competição não pode ser um entrave para a economia, mas ela também, você não pode ficar criando exceções a priori para determinados acordos, porque isso gera um risco, e na verdade a experiência de um século, mais ou menos, demonstra que normalmente esses acordos, eles viram algo ilegal. Eles podem até começar com uma intenção positiva, mas em algum determinado momento os incentivos para outro tipo de coordenação aparecem. Então, o histórico todo de cartel de crise mundial é assim. Por outro lado, eu não consigo ver, pelo menos aí do ponto de vista do CAD, uma negativa de olhar para um acordo efetivamente necessário para promover algum tipo de sustentabilidade, se houver boa-fé e compliance. Então, isso já aconteceu no CAD com questões que não são de sustentabilidade, mas aconteceu em dois momentos. Um momento foi uma greve de caminhoneiros aqui no Brasil, que parou o país, e que as distribuidoras de combustível precisaram fazer um acordo para uma pegar combustível da outra, para conseguir abastecer os postos. Nesse momento, o CAD aprovou, utilizou, eles foram ao CAD, pediram a permissão e a gente fez uma análise sucinta, não foi um aval, mas dizendo que se eles respeitassem determinadas circunstâncias, eles poderiam fazer aquilo para que não causasse desabastecimento no país. Na pandemia aconteceu também algo parecido, inclusive foi noticiado aqui no Brasil de maneira bastante extensiva, mas por conta do fechamento, do fechamento das lojas e tudo, principalmente bares e restaurantes que foram muito afetados por conta desse fechamento, tiveram um problema de distribuição. E aí os fornecedores, que não necessariamente competiam, fizeram um acordo para manter os seus canais de distribuição abertos, porque para eles era importante também. E o CAD analisou isso e entendeu que, respeitado, e nesse caso, até pela experiência anterior, já tinha até um compliance prévio mesmo, entendeu que aquilo poderia ser possível, porque aquilo, de fato, era melhor para a economia. Então, assim, o Maarten tocou muito em incentivos. Eu acho que quando existe realmente uma questão, e houver boa-fé e compliance, a autoridade antitrust não vai se negar a analisar e eventualmente dar um aval. Então, um acordo como esse, por exemplo, eu olho com desconfiança, assim, Lauro, a priori. Mas a gente teria que olhar mesmo as circunstâncias do caso concreto, assim, para entender qual é o que está por trás ali. E se isso foi feito de maneira aberta, anunciada, eu já retiro a má-fé daí, entendeu? De uma certa forma, você já tira esse elemento, que é um elemento típico de cartel, que é um elemento ali da clandestinidade, né? Então, acho que não é uma questão fácil, mas a gente, e eu tenho uma certa desconfiança de que isso pode ir para um lado ruim, né, um lado de coordenação de cartel mesmo, mas a gente analisaria partindo do princípio de que as empresas estão de boa fé. Eu acho que esse seria o caminho. Com relação às eficiências, talvez seja a única maneira mesmo de você incorporar uma questão de sustentabilidade. A grande dúvida que eu tenho com isso, e aí é uma opinião muito particular minha, pensando um pouco na agenda ESG e nos Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da ONU, é se num país como o Brasil, se eu for considerar a eficiência para ambiental, eu não teria que considerar outro tipo de eficiência, e aí talvez sim abriria a análise antitrust para uma caixa de Pandora. Mas assim, por exemplo, eu vejo pobreza, diminuição da desigualdade, promoção de diversidade, erradicação da pobreza, como temas muito mais urgentes no Brasil e que poderiam ser promovidos também pelo setor privado do que a questão ambiental. Assim, relativamente, o Brasil ainda é um país privilegiado do ponto de vista dos recursos naturais, do ponto de vista, enfim, a gente tem todo ano a gente tem uma crise hídrica que é superada porque chove no final do ano. Então a gente ainda tem isso. É claro que a gente tem que preservar, mas acho que tem outras questões mais urgentes. E aí abrir análise antitrust para isso significa abrir para qualquer coisa, entendeu? Qualquer eficiência. A gente perde tecnicidade e talvez não seja o nosso papel. A gente não tenha nem capacidade para isso.
Zuccolo, Ninette, Simon, Maarten, do you want to make any comment about this question and the agreements that Laura mentioned here?
I've not been able to understand any of it.
Oh,
Did you get a translation, Simon?
I'm afraid only at the very end. I found a translation button.
okay, sorry. So let's move to finish here. If you want to make any final remark, please feel free.
Well, if I may, I must make just a couple of points on incentives, and just highlight where I agree with Maarten and first, Maarten and I agree that if companies can compete on sustainability issues, then they should do so. Indeed, they're required to under European law, and I think as a matter of policy, that will be the case under most systems of antitrust law. And I think probably the chicken case and the Dutch coal case, which he referred to, are rightly decided. But the examples, the sort of situations we're talking about, are where companies are found that they can't compete on sustainability issues sufficiently. And I emphasize sufficiently, because yes, it is the case where there is some willingness to pay, you may be able to compete on sustainability issues. But frankly, we've for the last 5, 10, 15 years, I don't know, whatever, we've watched more sustainable products emerge, but they are still niche products. They are not changing the economy on the scale or the speed that we need. I think Ninette also made that point. And the final comment I would make is that I certainly agree. I would love to see us having a higher carbon price. I would like to see governments taxing more polluting activities. But just look at the extent of the disagreement on that issue. And that is always going to be on a national basis, absent some miraculous worldwide agreement. So all we're saying really is where companies are prepared to go further or quicker, let's encourage them to do so. And if they can't do that entirely on their own, let's not have antitrust stand in the way of that. We haven't got time to wait and experiment to see whether they might be able to do it on their own or whether regulation might come along. We need to move forward on all fronts now.
Yeah, so we do disagree because we will not be moving further ahead if we are allowing agreements. So again, you say we see too little, but my point is you'll see less. So what we should do is we should embrace and stimulate the green engine of competition. We should, inform consumers, make sure that where there is willingness to pay and awareness and willingness to buy and pay more for greener products, that consumers get all the possibilities for this, that firms are pushed to compete on that dimension and everything. That's where we will get some progress from the firms. And the fact that the government is doing very, very suboptimal, I fully share that, but that's not an excuse for then sort of throttling that green engine by allowing these horizontal agreements. Because by just saying we saw too little, that's not justification, because then still we have the problem that we will see less under agreements than we would see under competition if we just leave competition. However little that may be, less is always worse, I would say.
Well, at that point, I'm afraid, so we fundamentally, it just doesn't make any sense. It does not make sense if people have tried.
Well, it's a matter of thinking in terms of counterfactuals.
We need things to move forward more. We need both those. Let's stimulate competition. Let's inform consumers. That's the first policy choice. But if that is not working fast enough, let's not stand in the way of some more of some wonderful initiatives which people are trying to do.
Yeah, but we really need to compare those initiatives that you call wonderful against what would have happened without an agreement. Okay, and I'm just very skeptical on this. So it need to be a very, very well argued case. And so far, I've seen very few. For example, you will not be able to solve a first mover disadvantage problem by coordination amongst the firms. And we've shown that also in the paper. To the extent that these problems are real, they are not going to be resolved by horizontal agreements. So, when we talk about, and then I'll close, but, when we talk about what are the next steps, it's great that we are having these debates on ICN level and everything. But I think it's very, very important that we have a very deep law and economics debate
so that we are not going to make mistakes in this domain, because nobody wants those mistakes to be made. I think we all have the same objectives. We want to go to a greener world. We want more sustainability. So let's be very, very careful that we are not reducing the steps rather than stimulating them by taking the wrong measures. And competition policy, I think the domain is in procurement, state aid, but not in horizontal agreement. So it's very unfortunate that that's where most of the push is, I think.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Maarten. In the name of the IBRAC, I'd like to thank you, Ninette, Simon.
May I just make one final observation?
Okay.
And it's basically more of a plea. And I totally understand again, Maarten, where you're coming from, but the reality is with respect not in economic modeling, that the reality is what companies are saying and the fears, the genuine fears and concerns that companies are expressing. And I think that's incontrovertible evidence. It's not in the economic, as much as I respect economic arguments, econometrics, and so forth. The reality is that in the real world reality is that companies are saying there is a challenge, there is an issue. And so what I would ask is that to some extent, competition authorities just take that at face value and adopt the much needed guidance that companies are clamoring for. We can continue to have this debate in the future, but what is important right now is for companies to really get the much needed guidance so they can drive those competition initiatives and drive for a more sustainable environment and world.
And pointing at massive research, not just theory, and face value. Have a look at that blue and consumer detergents and whatnot, right? So we have to be really careful, I think. That's my warning.
Okay, thank you. In the name of IBRAC, I would like to thank you, Ninette, Simon, and Maarten. It was a very productive panel. It was it was great to hear so different point of views, and we have now, it's a privilege to us in Brazil to have you here also talking, and now we can make our own discussions or start to study this topic more. And that's it, and you can make a second session in it. I have an idea, I'm going to send you a message later. And also, Diogo, muito obrigada também por trazer aí a visão da autoridade brasileira e como as análises, enfim, espero que sejam feitas aqui no Brasil. E eu acho que podemos encerrar. Se ninguém mais tiver nenhuma dúvida ou pergunta, we can finish the panel here.
Obrigado.
Obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you.